So thank you once again, Mark, from Covering Climate Now, for joining the interview today. So I'm Mai from Climate Tracker, and we're going to start talking about the US elections and specifically how writers can find the climate angle in covering the upcoming election. So firstly, Mark, I actually want to ask a few questions about Covering Climate Now, and specifically, you just finished, I think, yesterday, the 2020 Climate Politics Week. So can you talk a little bit about, how that went, what were your goals, and if some difficulties, and what do you think about the results? I think you had more than 30 articles published on a different partner news outlets, right?
Well, first, thank you for having me. It's very nice to be with you. And here in California, it's still Monday, the 28th. So
right.
Yes. Our week is going through today, and indeed even tomorrow, because tomorrow, of course, is the first presidential debate of the 2020 elections, which we can certainly talk about, because climate change is not on the subject list that Chris Wallace of Fox News, the moderator for the debate, announced last week, and we have been critical of that, as have others in the US press, including the Washington Post's media critic, Margaret Sullivan, who actually spoke at the founding conference for Covering Climate Now. And just a quick word about Covering Climate Now. We're a very young organization. We were founded in April of 2019, co-founded by the Columbia Journalism Review at Columbia University in New York City, which of course gives out the Pulitzer Prizes, and The Nation magazine, which is the oldest continuously published weekly magazine in the United States, and in association with The Guardian newspaper, because The Guardian is, to our minds, the gold standard of climate coverage around the world. If there's one thing that you, as a writer or journalist, want to do to really be up to speed on the climate story, you could certainly do worse than make sure that you're reading The Guardian every day, except of course for checking the website at Covering Climate Now. So Covering Climate Now is a collaboration, voluntary, of now over 400 news outlet partners around the world. Our combined audience is roughly around 2 billion people. I say roughly because some of our biggest partners are Reuters and Bloomberg and Agence France-Presse news agencies that in turn deliver content to literally thousands of other newsrooms. So it's hard to put an exact number on our combined audience reach, but it is very large. And it also includes, in the United States, some of the biggest names in news: NBC News, CBS News, PBS, the public broadcasting system, most of the big radio stations, public radio stations around the country, major newspapers like the Philadelphia Inquirer, and websites like HuffPost and so forth. And all of us simply committed to nothing more or less than doing more and better coverage of the climate story, which has sadly been terribly neglected by the mainstream media in the United States for many years. It's gotten better in the last 18 months, I think partly because of what we're doing and partly because of what Mother Nature is showing to people. But the big question, and this is what I hope we'll be able to talk about here, is how will the media step up to now the 2020 election? And will they be making sure that climate change is part of the conversation as Americans prepare to vote in what is, according to the scientists, really the last election, the last chance for preventing outright climate breakdown.
So going off of the last thing that you just said, in terms of this election in particular being the last chance for us to really do something, I mean, every US presidential election gets some type of coverage and interest from abroad, but why do you think this one in particular is different and possibly more important than any of the ones before in terms of finding a climate angle?
Well, you're quite right that, of course, the US elections are always important to the rest of the world. I wrote a book a few years ago called The Eagle's Shadow: Why America Fascinates and Infuriates the World. And I quoted an Egyptian journalist colleague who said, half jokingly, but only half jokingly, you know, I've always wanted to write an opinion piece for the New York Times saying that we in the rest of the world deserve to be able to vote in your elections because your elections decide so much about our world, our economy, our politics, etc. So we're very aware of that at Covering Climate Now, and I'm happy to say that about a third of our 400 plus partners are outside of the United States, which is so important, I think, to a balanced view of the world. However, in this case of the 2020 elections, I do believe, simply because this is what the scientists say, that this really is a supremely important election in terms of climate change. And in fact, I'm doing this story right now, and it will be airing on 60 Minutes, apparently in the next week or so, which is by far the most popular and influential news program in American TV history, has been for 50 years. And we're working together on a piece that is about the California wildfires and the 2020 elections. And one of the scientists that they've interviewed, I'm also writing about in The Guardian this week to coincide with the 60 Minutes piece. And it's Dr. Michael Mann of Penn State University, who probably anybody who pays attention to climate news knows the name Michael Mann. He's arguably one of the 2 or 3 most prominent climate scientists in the world now. And he says, and this is a direct quote, 4 more years of Donald Trump would be, quote unquote, game over for climate. And Dr. Mann adds very provocatively, I think, that is not a political statement. That is a scientific statement with political implications. And he explains in the interview that we're doing, and I hope the interview that 60 Minutes did with him, that what he means by that is that everyone will remember about 2 years ago now, the landmark scientific report from the IPCC, the so-called 1.5 degrees report, that said we have 12 years, now 10, until 2030 to cut the emissions in half, or it would be a very cataclysmic climate future. And in order to do that, the scientists added, there have to be transformative, unprecedentedly fast and far-reaching changes in the transportation sector, in of course, the energy sector, the construction sector, the agriculture sector, the financial sector, the economic sector. What they didn't mention was the media sector, by the way, and that's how Climate Now got started. It was our realization that if we don't transform the media sector, none of those other sectors will transform because there won't be the public awareness and public pressure. Anyway, so Michael Mann references that 10-year deadline now to 2030. We have to cut the emissions in half by 2030 as a globe, right, internationally. Meaning it doesn't matter what this country alone or that country or group of countries, even the EU, which is showing great leadership, doesn't matter what they do if we don't all manage to do it. And so Michael Mann points out that if we are going to cut the emissions in half within 10 years, if we spend another 4 years under Donald Trump going in exactly the opposite direction at full speed, it literally becomes scientifically, physically impossible to reach your goal in 10 years because you will have gone backwards for another 4. That's his point. And that's why I think that the 2020 elections really are, as Michael says, it's make or break for climate. It's if the continuation, if the last 4 years continue, it will be game over for climate. So I think that's the big story, and it remains to be seen how much that will come through in US press coverage in these remaining weeks. But it is a very good sign, I will say, that the most important news program in the United States is going to, I hope, be saying something like that on one of its Sunday night broadcasts very soon.
Right. But like you quoted Michael Mann a bit earlier, he said that that is not a political statement. So for those who, especially not in the US, who might not be as familiar with the 2 candidates for the US election race, this is a little bit of a basic question, but what do you personally think are the biggest differences in climate policy between Trump and Biden, maybe beyond sort of their political party affiliations?
Yeah, I don't think it's, science doesn't care about political parties. The science of carbon dioxide remains true, whether politicians accept it or journalists, for that matter, accept it. So the biggest difference is that you have an incumbent president of the biggest climate polluter in history, the United States, which, by the way, China gets a bad rap. And please, as journalists, do not repeat this mistake of so prevalent in especially U.S. and Western media coverage that China is the biggest climate emitter right now. It is true on an annual basis that China is now the biggest emitter. On a historic basis, which is what the atmosphere cares about, the U.S. is about twice as big. So let's be clear about that. So you have now at the United States in Washington as president a man who not only doesn't believe in climate science, he doesn't understand climate science. He said something the other day that should be disqualifying for a president of the United States. He said that the temperatures on Earth, he told the California governor, talking about wildfires, that the Earth's temperatures are going back down. You just watch, unquote. Well, the science is unequivocal on that. There is zero chance that the temperatures on this planet are going to be going down anytime in the next 30 years at a minimum, because of the simple inertia of the climate system and the fact that carbon dioxide molecules stay up there forever. So you've got a president who doesn't believe that, doesn't understand it, and therefore has zero plan for dealing with it, which again is arguably a disqualification for being the president of the United States, I would argue, as a journalist. Now, facing him, and of course, just one more note on that, he is backed up by a Republican Party inside of the Congress that shares that view, at least insofar as their denial of climate science and their refusal to do anything about the problem. Now, facing him, of course, is the Democrat, Joe Biden, who was the vice president for 8 years under Barack Obama, who has been interested in climate change for a very long time, but who has undergone quite a journey, I would say, in his climate policy. At the start of the 2020 campaign, climate activists were so disappointed with Biden's climate plan that they literally gave it an F on the part of the Sunrise Movement, which is arguably the most vibrant part of the US climate movement at this point. They're the ones who really, more than any other group, put the Green New Deal on the political agenda in the United States. So they gave Biden an F because he lacked ambition, which I thought was frankly a little harsh, but certainly Biden was nowhere near a Green New Deal back in January. Well, guess what? Now he is. Biden's climate policy, which calls for spending $2 trillion over the next 10 years to try and move the United States towards a carbon neutral economy. In particular, the centerpiece of Biden's plan promises to create completely carbon-free electricity by the year 2035, which would be a big deal. And I would argue, although I imagine the Biden campaign might contest this, that Biden's current climate position is a Green New Deal in all but name. He will not call it a Green New Deal, just like on healthcare. He doesn't call it Medicare for all, but he's pretty close to that. So you've got one candidate who at least understands the science, and Biden, to his credit, does understand that we face a climate emergency. And by the way, climate emergency, that's not an activist term. That is what the scientists now call it. So again, in terms of being an accurate and on the curve journalist, you want to be aware that it's, because you're going to hear this in your newsrooms, that to use the term climate emergency is activist. That's exactly what I've been told by one of the biggest news organizations in the world, whose name I can't disclose right now, but they feel like that's activist because activists say it. Well, guess who else says it? Michael Mann and 13,000 of the world's leading climate scientists now in a peer-reviewed journal talk about this as a climate emergency. So Biden understands that. He at least is proposing a plan that somewhat matches the scale of the crisis. So there's your difference. One person who is trying to step up to it and one person who denies it.
Right. Yeah, thank you for actually covering also the Green New Deal, which was one of the policy questions that I wanted to get to. But another policy related question that I had was about the Paris Agreement and in terms of the US planned withdrawal from that. And more broadly, is the US position in this global collaboration for more climate action. How do you think international journalists might find an angle in that with the upcoming election? And specifically, since you also mentioned China, Xi Jinping recently announced their plan for being climate neutral by at least 2060, but seems like that hasn't gotten a lot of coverage or very skeptical coverage worldwide. So what are your thoughts on that?
It is very interesting what President Xi said the other day. I have followed the climate politics and actions in China for many years now. I was actually, in 1996 and 97, I was the first Western journalist to get into China and do a detailed expose of the then emerging climate and environmental crisis in China, and saw right away that China and the US were the two climate superpowers on this planet. So it matters a great deal what China does. And you're also right that historically, especially here in the United States, although also in Europe, I would say, China has gotten, I think, unfair coverage on the climate front very often for not good reasons. And that's not to say that what China does is always great. I'm the last person who would say that. But when a major power does something, says something that is objectively in the interests of human survival, I think it's the journalist's role to acknowledge that. And China has been far more aggressive on climate policy than the United States has. If you're comparing the two climate superpowers, historically, there's no question who has done more and who has been more of an obstacle. So, and the Paris Agreement is a very good example of that, actually. Why is it that the Paris Agreement is only an agreement and not a treaty? That's because of Washington. That's because the Republican parties and big oil's control inside of Washington, in particular inside of the United States Congress, was so great, was so strong that Biden and, of course, President Barack Obama and Secretary of State John Kerry all realized that there was no way that the United States Senate would approve of the Paris Treaty. And in the United States, it's the Senate, the United States Senate and the Congress that has to approve a treaty. The president can propose treaties, but it doesn't become official until the United States Senate ratifies it. And so the agreement that they made in Paris in 2015, and I was there covering that, was an agreement, or in French, an accord, not a treaty. And it was precisely because even though a treaty would obviously be better in terms of its international force, but it was left out because the United States would not do it. And I could name you 12 examples going back to 1992. I covered the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil in 1992, where all this began. The United States has always been the #1 obstacle to progress at the international climate talks from the beginning, along with Saudi Arabia and the obvious, suspects in the oil countries. But none of them had the power that the United States has to really block things, as opposed to China. China is certainly capable of blocking things, and this is not. I'm not doing an apologia for China, and frankly, I'm equally skeptical about President Xi's promises about climate neutrality in 2060. I would love to see it, but I want to see the details. And I have covered China enough to know that it's one thing what the, as they say, the emperor in Beijing can say one thing, but that doesn't mean that that's what's going to happen across the country, because as they say in the rest of the country, but the mountains are high and the emperor is far away. So is President Xi, I'm very glad he's saying it, but is that going to happen? Well, that again is a place where so much will depend on the United States election in 2020. Of course, if there's a Donald Trump re-election, that's one thing. But if there's a Joe Biden who is saying to China, yes, let's do this together, and if you do that, we'll do this, obviously the chances of international success, although not guaranteed, are much greater.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so bringing it back to the U.S., I think typically the executive branch and the president and the election gets a lot more attention, but with the recent passing away of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the judicial branch has been getting quite a lot of coverage as well. And for an international audience, what do you think people need to know in order to understand the U.S. Supreme Court's impending rightward shift, and does that pose a concern for environmental protection and climate legislation in general?
I'm happy to address that, but I want to be careful here. I think we as journalists always need to be cautious before we assume that things will happen that have not happened yet. Our role is not to predict. Our role is to report and to analyze. Sometimes that involves looking at potential scenarios. But I think it's a mistake for us to assume that that there will necessarily be a new person added to the Supreme Court.
That too.
Mitch McConnell claims that he has the votes. We'll see. We'll see. I think it's going to be very difficult for Republican senators in general who are running for re-election this fall to answer the question of why they are, and their party is just blatantly going back on what they said, that you shouldn't be appointing or you shouldn't be approving a Supreme Court justice in the final year of a president's term. So we'll see what happens with that. I can speak certainly more broadly to the question of what will happen if that occurs, if there is if a conservative justice does get appointed. But I think it also will depend on the circumstances. Right now, of course, anything can happen, but right now it's looking very likely that President Trump will lose the popular vote in a landslide, and possibly the Electoral College vote as well in a landslide, and that the Republicans will lose control of the Senate. I wrote about this in The Nation magazine last week. One of the big questions about a Green New Deal under a potential Biden presidency is not just will the Democrats flip control of the Senate and be able to pass something in the Senate, but will they have enough of a majority in the Senate to be able to pass a Green New Deal, even though the senator from West Virginia, who's a coal state guy, is probably going to vote against that. So they'll lose a vote there. So I think that and here I'm breaking my own rule a little bit about predicting, but I think that this Supreme Court fight is not going to help President Trump and Senate Republicans over the next 5 weeks as they run for re-election. I think it's probably going to hurt them, and the initial polling suggests that that's true. So then you're in a situation where, let's assume that both Trump loses and the Republican senators lose their majority. Well, then you've got a situation where a lame duck president and a lame duck Senate are voting after they have been repudiated by the voters. They are voting on a lifelong appointment to the United States Supreme Court. Will they still do that? Well, okay, well, let's see. If they do, getting back to your question, what happens? What does that mean for climate policy? Obviously, it means a great deal for many things, but the assumption, the sort of the conventional wisdom now in political and media circles in the United States is that the Judge Barrett that Trump appointed would definitely be a far-right judge. And in addition to looking askance at Roe versus Wade on abortion rights, and the Obamacare, of course, Medicare for all, she would also have a role on a number of climate-related policies, the most important of which is arguably whether the United States federal government and in particular the Environmental Protection Agency, does it have the legal authority to regulate greenhouse gases? Very famous decision in 2007, the state of Massachusetts versus EPA. And that was held to yes, but the federal government does have that authority, and the Obama administration used that authority to push forward very strong regulations of, in particular, power plants. So assume that Judge Barrett becomes Supreme Court Justice Barrett, and there is then a 6-3 majority. One can be pretty confident that the forces of delay and denial on climate change will launch a court case, and she would presumably vote against the federal government having that power. But that's way out in the speculative realm. I think that for right now, if you're a writer and you're covering the next few weeks of the U.S. elections, I wouldn't be looking at that. I would be looking much more at what climate change is going to do in some of the battleground states. There's about 6 battleground states that are critical. 5 of those 6 states are already experiencing severe climate impacts. And very interestingly, especially among younger voters, the millennial generation and the Gen Z generation, they're 37 million of the eligible voters this fall. That was just reported by our colleagues at NBC News last week. And for them, especially if they're Democrats, but even if they're Republicans, climate change matters a lot. So it's going to be very interesting to see, and some of our partners did these stories this week. It'd be very interesting to see how the youth vote in general goes. The Sunrise Movement, rather, is promising to keep up its string of electoral victories. So far, they've been knocking off sort of centrist Democrats in Democratic primaries. But now they're playing in the big field. Now they're playing in the general election. And they are concentrating on 3 states, 3 of the battleground states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And we'll see. But I'm also interested in, this would be a very, I think, interesting and revealing angle for international reporters to look at. It's not just the climate activist kids who are involved here in this election. Look at the young conservatives and the young evangelical Christians. Some of them are caring about climate change now because of their generation, and they are frustrated with their elders who keep mouthing this, to them, nonsensical denial of climate science, because they feel like, hey, this is my future you're talking about. Denial is not good enough. And so, again, I urge people to look at our website at Covering Climate Now, and you can see under the Partner Stories vertical, there was a very good couple of stories on how will young evangelical Christians who happen to be climate activists, they're struggling now with this question of, who do I vote for? I don't want Biden because he approves of women's right to choose on abortion, but I don't want Trump because he's going to burn up the planet. So it's a very interesting story, and I think it reveals something deeper about American culture and American politics.
Right. But that was talking more about sort of still younger voters, right, and the youth vote and youth population. I think I saw a recent poll from Yale Climate Communications where climate change only ranked like 13th out of 18th of voters concerned in the US. So what do you think the media could perhaps do better in terms of covering this issue in a way that would appeal to, I guess, non-youth votes, as well as people who are reading the news who are not young people from around the world?
Well, the main thing that the United States mainstream media has needed to do for a long time is to break its climate silence. That has been the focus of our work at Covering Climate Now. Is just to get them to cover the story and to include it. It's not just a climate story, but to include the climate angle when you're reporting on weather, when you're reporting on these wildfires. That I'm in California, I can smell the smoke outside my window right now. Or when you're reporting on the hurricanes, that we have so many hurricanes this year that the meteorologists and the scientists have run out of names for them. When you're doing those stories, bring up the climate angle. Talk about what is now unequivocal in the scientific field, which is that that climate change is not causing those, but it is certainly intensifying them. And so I think that that's the main thing that the media needs to do. It needs to recognize that the climate story is as important as any other story out there. And that's why it's so distressing that Chris Wallace of Fox News decided to leave climate change out, indefensibly decided to leave it out of the conversation that he's going to have with Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden tomorrow. So I think that's the main thing that the media could do. It's not the media's job, by the way, to get people interested in something or to tell them how to vote, but it is our job to make sure that citizens understand the situation. That is our job, because the average person, they can't possibly sort through all of the data and information and the deceptions and the spin that comes out of politics. And I don't mean just about climate change, about any issue. That's our role as journalists. You know, we're supposed to be able to separate the truth from the fiction, to separate the important from the trivial, and give voters and citizens in general what they need, the information and the perspectives that they need to be able to understand the situation facing them and their families and their community and their country. And if you're taking that responsibility seriously, as any journalist should, you have got to be paying, frankly, far more attention to the climate story than most of the mainstream media in the United States has been doing for a very long time.
So to wrap up our discussion, because I think we're running out of time, talking about journalists being the people who sift through all of this data and give readers the best idea of what's happening. What would you recommend as some resources for journalists, especially again those not based in the U.S., to cover the upcoming election? Maybe it could be like data sets or image banks or Twitter accounts, even, or some tools that they could follow.
I'm so glad you asked that question, because that's exactly what we put together at the resources page at Covering Climate Now. So please come to www.coveringclimatenow.org and go to our resources page. You don't have to be a member of Covering Climate Now to do that, but of course we invite all bona fide journalists and newsrooms to join us. It doesn't cost you any money. But you can go to that resources page, and we have everything from a politics reporting guide, Climate Politics 2020 reporting guide, which is filled with story ideas, lists of reliable sources, especially scientists, activists, politicians, etc. We have even images that you can license for free for your coverage. Some not, but many that you can. And in general, just a lot of links to people whose Twitter feeds you should be following. And I think also another thing that I would recommend, although it's a little US centric, but if you're trying to cover the US elections, it's not bad. Go to Climate Nexus, that's Nexus, Climate Nexus. And they do a daily summary of the main climate news stories in the United States media. And frankly, it's too many. You don't need all that, but it's a good window into what are the key climate issues at the time and who are where some of the reporting is coming. Also, please sign up for our newsletter at Covering Climate Now. Every week, every Wednesday, we do a newsletter that you're free to get, where we try to talk about the coverage in general, but we also point out 5 or 6, maybe 8 of the best climate stories of the week. And oftentimes they're related to politics, not always, but these are stories that we think are either exceptionally well done as journalism or exceptionally important, talking about a part of the climate story that all of us as journalists need to understand better. So those are some of the resources that I would suggest. And above all, I would just say, be as creative and as determined as you can. This is by far the most important story of our time. And if and when we do have a future, and I speak as the father of a 15-year-old girl, and I sure hope we have a future for her. You will be able to look back at this time, at this critical moment in the history of our civilization, and know that you did your part to try and deal with the overriding challenge of our time, which is climate change, and to talk about the solutions. That's the other thing that I would emphasize. In the coverage of this election, it is stunning that we're talking actually in the United States about a real solution, the Green New Deal. It is the first time, and I've covered the climate story for 30 years, I actually proposed a global Green Deal in a book I wrote 20 years ago about this. So it's very interesting to see that idea now finally rising up in American politics. And it's now the de facto position of the Democratic nominee. So that's where I would go if I were writing stories from outside, is to don't pay too much attention to what, with all due respect, the New York Times and the Washington Post and the mainstream media are telling you about the American election. That's mainly just channeling what is being said in Washington. It is very exciting and interesting that the major opposition party is now backing a Green New Deal, which is pretty close to what absolutely has to happen if we're going to survive the climate crisis. That's a very interesting story. And why that happened is because the Sunrise Movement made it happen. So if I were doing stories, look to the Sunrise Movement. That's the story. And you can look at, in fact, I did an interview a week ago that we did as part of our week of coverage with the Sunrise Movement's executive director and co-founder, a woman named Varshini Prakash. And so look at that and look at what they're doing. It's really it's a great political story, whatever happens. And I think that's kind of the big question that I want to know on election night is, did the climate kids, I call them kids because I'm older now, the people in their teens and their 20s who have upended climate politics around this world, thank God, in the last 2 years, can they deliver the vote in November? That's the big question, because if they vote, if they get young people to vote, it's over for President Trump. And that would be very good news on the climate front. And that is a scientific statement, not a political one.
All right. Thank you so much, Mark, for those concluding thoughts and for sharing the resources on Covering Climate Now. I hope a lot of the people who are watching this interview will check out our website and reconsider what are the things you can focus on while covering the upcoming U.S. election from a climate change angle. Thank you again for making the time to join us today. And yeah, just have a good rest of your Sunday night.
It's Monday night.
Oh, yes, Monday night. Thank
you. Thank you very much, Maya. And tell everybody if they can if they have questions, they should feel free to email me at Covering Climate Now.
All right.
Okay. Good night.